We are heading into our last day of week 4 of Mythic Plus Season 1 in Dragonflight. It has been the first tyrannical push week with some pretty forgiving affixes being Raging and Storming. And today I'm going to be talking about what I've been doing and playing for the past week, and then discussing the healer tier list, the kind of how the healer meta is shaping up. And finally, I'll be looking at the dungeon ease tier list, so how the dungeons compare to one another as far as difficulty goes. This is probably going to be a bit of a long one because I have surprisingly been having a lot of success with Mistweaver this week, which is not something I thought would happen last week. So I'm going to be talking quite a bit about what I've been trying, where I was going wrong in the past, and why it's working out so well for me now. As you can see from the footage, it has been a casting based Mistweaver, not a Fistweaver, but I'll be getting into the specifics of that a little bit later on. So I started the week doing a couple of keys on every healer, and in the first day I was focused on obviously getting my vault stuff and then running whatever keys I could that were upgrades that I had gotten from the vault on any of my healers. As you can imagine, playing 7 different specs and trying to run 8 dungeons on fortified and tyrannical, at least for all of them, it takes quite a bit of time, and a few of my healers were just missing tyrannical keys altogether or a couple of dungeons. So I was trying to fill in the gaps to raise my Raider IO enough that getting invited into the average, 10 to 12 pug key got easier. So that's what I was focused on at the start of the week, was just getting into 10 to 12 keys. Most of my healers are 380-ish, 385-ish item level. So I'm at the point now where I'm just trying to spam 10s or 12s to just try and get gear. And what I noticed this week, especially with it being tyrannical and the first week that I really got to get into keys that are high enough that a few mistakes on tyrannical bosses can mean deaths. And what I've noticed this week is that I would broadly categorize all the healers in one of 2 ways. I'm going to say that there are the high throughput healers that everyone is now familiar with: Resto, Druid, Preservation Evoker, Holy Paladin. I didn't know it yet, but I would also put Mistweaver up there. I guess it's a bit of a radical thing at the moment, but I'm going to, go out on a limb and say that I think right now, this is prior to the 5% Vivify, 5% flat throughput buff that Mistweavers are going to receive tomorrow. I think even prior to that, Mistweavers are S tier throughput. I'm not ready to say that they're an S tier healer, especially when, at least as far as sub creation goes and most of the community kind of perception or opinions goes at the moment. The S tier healers, part of the reason they're S tier is because one of them brings a battle res and one of them brings a bloodlust. And Mistweaver doesn't have that sort of utility. It also does less damage and a couple of other minor things here and there. So again, I'm not confident enough to put them in S tier outright, but I will say that from a throughput perspective alone, I think Mistweaver has, it has Resto Druid tier throughput. At least, maybe even more than that. I'm going to have to get more gear and get more practice to really figure this out. But from what I've been seeing and playing this week, casting Mistweaver does ridiculous healing, and next week it's going to be even higher. So like I was saying, there are the high throughput healers and then there are the low throughput healers. The low throughput healers at the moment for me is everything else. Holy Paladin is somewhere in between, and obviously this is it's a little bit difficult to explain, because obviously not all healers do high or low throughput all the time. Sometimes you do need high sustained throughput, sometimes you need high single target throughput, sometimes you need high AoE burst throughput, and generally the high throughput healers I'm talking about can do all of those things. And then you get a few other instances with things like Resto Shaman that can do very high burst stacked healing, but kind of lacking in every other healing throughput category. So what I was noticing is that in the high throughput healer category, I could just push keys almost mindlessly. I could just join a group and run a key, and whether or not we timed the key never really came down to my personal play, unless mistakes happen. But as far as throughput goes, as far as being able to heal bosses to heal through debuffs and things like that. On the high throughput healers, that was never a concern to me. Where it got a little bit sketchy once I got into the 12s and 13 kind of key range was with the low throughput healers, so everything else. And it usually came down to like one mistake here or one kind of weird way that the group did a boss fight or did a trash pack or tried to pull 2 packs or something happened and I wasn't able to heal certain situations. Now, some examples to get an idea of what I'm talking about here. If I went into Herja and someone overlapped the Expel Light on 1 or 2 people while they were stacked in the bubble, and that extra level of damage just from a simple mistake could often be enough that meant, you know, someone died on that. Or if DPS weren't using personal defensive cooldowns, then that was a situation where things, you know, I could brick a key very easily just because I was effectively always feeling like I was triage healing those kind of scenarios where what you really want is just blanket raw throughput on all 5 targets. Now, my lack of throughput on the kind of low category throughput healers that I'm talking about, I would say partially comes down to gear obviously being 380 or 385 or something and trying to effectively push into mid to higher range tyrannical keys. Obviously I could just get more gear and a lot of those issues kind of go away. A big part of the gearing is also trinkets. Having something like the Expel Light, the AoE heal trinket that drops in Halls of Valor can also solve a lot of those problems. And the third way, or I guess the second way other than gearing, is to try and solve those issues by making better groups. And that comes down to either playing with better players that use, you know, health pots and personals and don't, you know, take any avoidable damage or as little avoidable damage as possible, or just bringing DPS classes especially that are far more durable. So especially if I'm running my own keys, which is what I ended up doing on the low throughput healers, I would invite warlocks and demon hunters and rogues, and I would try and avoid inviting, you know, more than one mage or hunter or those kind of squishy classes where I could avoid it. Now, all of this is not to say that I kind of hit a wall or things got too hard. It more just, it felt like my progress was slowing down. That's really all it came down to. I ended up spending quite a bit of time trying to push keys and gain some rating on my Disc Priest. And this is definitely where I felt it the most. And that was like, okay, I don't have gear, or I should probably be closer to 400 item level rather than like 385. I should probably have at least one decent trinket. I don't have any at the moment, and I should probably play my own keys to form my own group so I can take at least one tanky DPS and prioritize trying to find as self-sufficient tanks as possible. So that's what I ended up doing, and I could still progress keys and everything just fine, at least for now in the 12, 13, 14 range. Probably even 15 to 16 range would also be fine depending on the dungeon, because that is, I guess, the other factor here is a lot. It seemed like on a lot of my weaker healers, the keys I was getting was like Ruby Life Balls, Temple of the Jade Serpent, Knockhood Offensive, the kind of dungeons that all have one very scary boss fight in them. But if I was getting Court of Stars or Shadow Moon Burial Grounds or something, I don't think I would have any of these issues on any healer at the moment. And when I was playing my Mistweaver early in the week, I was playing a Fistweaving build like everybody else right now that's playing Mistweaver. The entire Raider.io leaderboard, like everywhere I look, everyone is only playing Fistweaving builds. And I kind of ran into the same problems that I see a lot of other, even like the top Mistweaver players have. And that is just lack of throughput. So when my progression slowed, I ended up spending a bit of time going and watching some streams and reading guides and things like that to try and figure out what I was doing wrong or what I could do better to increase my healing throughput to get through some of these trickier boss fights. And a lot of the time it's only one small little area that I'm trying to improve on. Like if I'm going into a Ruby Life Pools, I'm just trying to figure out what other people are doing to heal through, let's say on Meladrusa, I'm just trying to figure out how I heal through the hail bombs that not quite overlap, but the hail bombs that come out and then like back to back is the Chill Storm. Like those kind of like double AoE events. I'm trying to figure out what I can do to play better in those situations. Same thing with the second last boss in Ruby Life Pools, trying to do better with the overlap of Inferno and the Blaze Binder ability, the double AoEs. And usually when I'm talking about the low throughput healers, it isn't that they always have low throughput, it's when those kind of spicy situations show up every now and then, healing through all the storms in not good offensive on Tempest and stuff like that. That's where, at least in my play, they have come up short. And what was a little bit disappointing is I was going to the streams and stuff and I was watching the highest level players play, and I was looking at what they were doing in those dungeons, and I was noticing that they weren't really healing for much more than I was. Most of them, even at 405, 408 item level, were almost never breaking 50k HPS. And this was during times where health bars in their party were staying low for like quite a while. So if they had the throughput, it would have been higher. It's just that they kind of capped out at that kind of 50, maybe 60k HPS range, unless they were on a boss fight that buffed their throughput, like Stone Step in Temple of the Jade Serpent, or even on Tempest in Not Good Offensive. In those situations they could burst higher, but generally what I found was that every time I looked at like how I could heal a situation better, it effectively turned into like, here's a tutorial on how you heal this boss fight without ever breaking 50k HPS. And it was the sorts of things I had started doing myself, and that was like, okay, play with tanks that don't need any healing at all, play with warlocks, play with rogues, play with demon hunters, play with windwalkers even that have a lot of defensive cooldowns, and expect or like hope that your DPS are going to use health pots when situations get really dire. So after all of this, I spent a day or day and a half or whatever of like playing Resto Shaman, Disc Priest, Fistweaver, and I was going into the same kind of keys, Ruby Life Pools, 11, 12, 13, 14, whatever every time, and then I stepped into a 16 Ruby Life Pools and got folded. And I know, like in that situation, I know that I was on my Disc Priest at the time, and I know that I could go and get the Hov Trinket, and I can get better gear and do the things I've just discussed, which I will be doing in the next couple of weeks. But then I also thought to myself, okay, why don't I go and play the same keys on the quote-unquote better healers and see how I go. So that's exactly what I did. And I played Druid and Preservation Evoker, and I laughed at how many mechanics I completely forgot about or completely overestimated how hard they really were on the other healers, when the high throughput healers a lot of the times don't even notice them. Something as simple as like the Eye of the Storm Herja in Halls of Valor. If I'm on a low throughput healer, I'm healing through the Eye of the Storm phases, effectively triage healing. I am picking out the squishiest 1 or 2 DPS and probably myself, and I'm just trying to keep 3 people alive, maybe even 2 people alive, and I'm assuming that the rogue's going to press faint, or the demon hunter's going to have meta up or something, right? And I completely ignore the tank in that situation, which is exactly what even like the top level Fistweavers or top level Disc Priests, that's exactly what they do. And then I'm trying to remember or plan around having a cooldown up, like even a tank cooldown, to make sure that as the storm ends, if the tank's on half health or something, or 40% or whatever, that I use a cooldown on the tank just in case the tank doesn't have a cooldown available for the Shield of Light. And then when I go and do the exact same fight on a Druid, and I completely forget about the Shield of Light mechanic entirely because the tank's permanently at 100% health anyway, so it never even dawned on me that the tank could die because I haven't healed them at all for the entire Eye of the Storm phase. Just small little things like that have become quite noticeable kind of comparing the healers. So after all of that, I also took another stab at Mistweaver, and I decided that the Fistweaver build had too many problems for my liking, and I am not trying to say that like it's obviously good enough to a point because the best players in the world are making it work. At the end of the day, it's strong enough, and it's actually really fun. I just wish it was a little bit numerically stronger, but it's strong enough that the best players in the world are making it work in some of the hardest, not really the hardest, but they're doing well with it. But for me, it had too many issues for my liking. And the main one was melee. After that, it was the kind of random nature of ancient teachings. And I think those issues kind of boiled down into the fact that I could make Fistweaving work and feel good sometimes, but not all the time. And that was the real issue for me. Some bosses it's great on, some it's terrible on. Some trash packs being in melee all the time is fine, some it's not. Sometimes Shiji was enough of a cooldown and felt okay, and then other times it just was nowhere near enough to heal through some of the scenarios I was trying to heal through, at least at my kind of gear level and skill level. So what I did was take another look at Mistweaving, the casting Mistweaving build. And I knew like a lot of my issues could be solved if I had effectively two things. Efficient maintenance healing, or like rotational healing that didn't burn through my whole mana bar, and powerful cooldowns. And I knew that if I could make a build that effectively focused on or had those two things, I could solve a lot of the problems I was having or hurdles I was having in keys by just being able to efficiently heal up mistakes or like sloppy play, and also having huge on-demand burst healing for when I really needed it. The very difficult boss fights, the AoE overlaps, those kind of situations. Now quickly, before I get into everything about Mistweaver, about this build, I have tried a few caster Mistweaver builds in the past, and I think where I got really hung up on, the kind of mistake I made, well, I was trying to play around Vivify and Enveloping Mist too much, and then I was taking talents like life cycles to try and reduce the mana cost, but most non-lethal damage, just the party took a big hit of damage and all I need to do is top them up in the next 20 seconds or something before the next hit of damage. And on those sorts of builds that focused on Vivify and Enveloping Mist, I found that effectively always having to use multiple casts to heal through even just like maintenance or like incidental damage meant that my mana never felt healthy. So that was problem number one. And secondly, that I was always playing around Rising Mists. I think to me, and probably I guess a lot of other people at the moment, Rising Mists equals Renewing Mist coverage, and Renewing Mist coverage equals Vivify good, or viable, playable, a button that's worth pressing. So I was always trying to make caster builds that still had Rising Mists, because without Rising Mists, I would always lose a lot of my Renewing Mist coverage, and it felt like I needed Rising Mists to get good value out of Enveloping Mists and things. So then I was always playing these caster builds that were kind of pseudo Fistweavers because they were still always pressing Rising Sun Kick. So it was clunky and it used a lot of mana. And then I decided to, I guess, go in a slightly different direction, but the kind of small differences here make a huge difference in how the builds play. So what I did was play something like this. I'm still experimenting a little bit with it, but for now the kind of main points of this build is that it is a Tear of Morning build and a Unison build. Like I said, I was focusing on two things: efficient rotational healing, mana efficient rotational healing, and very powerful cooldowns. And Unison gives me the very efficient kind of spot healing, maintenance healing, whatever non-lethal damage, just topping people up slowly kind of healing. Effectively doesn't really cost any mana. And then Tear of Morning with the middle branch, so Secret Infusion and Invoker's Delight, is the most insane burst like throughput AoE healing I could imagine. It's off the charts. I'm going to go into this build in a little bit of detail right now, but I'll release another video tomorrow where I go into like the full nitty-gritty of the build with some examples of the sort of throughput I've been able to achieve and the like efficient healing and the talent choices and gearing setups and all that kind of stuff. So as far as the class tree goes, a lot of this is up to you. I have been playing a far more damage oriented build that looks like this, even going so far as to drop close to heart to get the fatal touch nodes. But when I go into higher keys, or at least like high keys for me at the moment, well, I just did a 16 Halls of Valor tyrannical. So I went in, dropping the damage nodes, taking the avoidance, and taking bounce back for the damage reduction. At the moment I have like 1 point left over at the end. I'm not quite sure where to put it. I like it in Escape from Reality just because the quality of life of being able to port back to where you ported from is quite nice. But the class tree is pretty generic, run-of-the-mill. Most people run a build similar to this. As far as the spec tree goes, I have effectively just avoided all the normal Fistweaving nodes. I don't take Teachings, obviously. I don't take Spirit of the Crane. I take Yulon instead of Shiji. I think Zen Pulse can be anything you want here out of those three. I just take Zen Pulse because I want the damage. And I don't press Essence Font much at all. I mean, maybe once a dungeon. So taking Font of Life seems like a waste, and same with Uplifted Spirits. If I really feel like I need Revival to be stronger, then I would drop Zen Pulse and take Uplifted Spirits just for the 15% hot that gets tacked onto Revival. I think in 10.0.5, when Revival gets the double healing treatment in dungeons, this is going to be much better. But for now, it's just Zen Pulse for the damage. I think Healing Elixir is almost mandatory for every Mistweaver build. It's just so good. Off the global cooldown, 30% health if you need it. This is the button that makes healing a lot of scary encounters much more manageable, because you know that while you're healing other people, if you drop low at any point, you can also heal yourself up. I take Overflowing Mists because I have found in some situations it can be 10 to 20% of my healing, especially on Guardian Druids. It seems to be particularly strong. It's just a nice extra tank heal, 2 points basically. If I was going to drop 2 points anywhere up in this middle section, if I really wanted something else, I would drop Overflowing Mists. And when the Life Cocoon buff and the new talent comes in to make Life Cocoon get the Burst of Life effect, if you want it, this is probably the 2 points I'll be looking at taking out. And instead of these two, I would come out here to buff my Life Cocoon significantly. Prior to 10.0.5, I might actually look at dropping this to take Calming Coalescence just for Temple of the Jade Serpent, because the tank buster on the second last boss, I'm assuming gets pretty crazy, and being able to drop like a 500k shield or something on a tank could be very helpful. The rest of these middle nodes are pretty generic. Obviously, you take Mist Wrap because you're casting Enveloping Mists, at least with this build, very often. I also like Yulon's Whisper. I'm taking Clouded Focus at the moment, but I'm thinking of swapping this and maybe 1 point somewhere else to take Peaceful Mending instead. But the kind of gist of the build is down in this bottom capstone section. So most Fistweaver builds obviously take the Feline Stomp branch and they take Rising Mists, which means they forego Secret Infusion, they forego Invoker's Delight, they forego Unison or Mending Proliferation. What that effectively means is that they are playing the Feline Stomp branch for their efficient spot healing, maintenance healing kind of thing, and they're obviously relying on Shiji for their cooldown healing. And the way this caster build works is that you use your Soothing Mist with Unison to do a lot of your maintenance healing, rotational healing, and then your big bursty cooldown healing is all through Yulon. So the bread and butter of this build is Tear of Morning, and that is because most of my healing is Enveloping Mist. The numbers on this is a little bit skewed. As you can see, apparently I hit a 72k crit Soothing Mist tick. That's because this was a Temple of the Jade Serpent, and I got up to 50 stacks of the debuff on Stone Step. So I was doing 80k HPS doing nothing but channeling Soothing Mist by the end of the fight, so that was pretty fun. But most of my healing is, over the course of a dungeon, always going to be Enveloping and some Soothing Unison healing, but mostly Enveloping Mist. And that is because every time I cast Enveloping Mist, I spawn a 6-second Renewing Mist with Rapid Diffusion. I apply a buff that causes my target to heal for 2% of their health every time they take damage. My Enveloping Mist lasts 7 seconds and increases the healing that target takes by 40%. 20% of the healing my Enveloping Mist does gets cleaved onto all of my Renewing Mist targets through Tear of Morning. And then if I have to cast more than once, basically most or all of those effects except one are increased by 15%. So that's the bread and butter of this build. If I do the same thing with Yulon up, I get all the same effects, but then I also proc Enveloping Breath every time I do it. The surprising part about this build to me was that with Secret Infusion and Invoker's Delight, my haste gets pretty crazy. So at the moment, I have 28% haste. If I use Secret Infusion to proc haste and press Yulon, my haste is going to go very, very high, like 96%, which is more than I guess it should be going by the tooltips. But yeah, It means that when I'm going into a Herja Storm or a Tempest Storm or a Quarter Stars Slicing Winds or any of those kind of big, scary AoE throughput situations, I can have on demand 100% haste. And then I press my Enveloping Mists and I get all of the effects I said before, and my healing just takes off. Earlier in the week, I sustained without the buff on Stone Step at all. I was doing 65k, I think, HPS on Stone Step without any issues whatsoever. And that is because the throughput you can do with Yulon up and pressing Enveloping is crazy. Now, while I'm doing all of that and getting all those Enveloping Mist effects, I'm also healing with Soothing and Unison and Statue's Unison. So that is the kind of basic power of the build. If you want to be very efficient with your healing, with your mana, and you use Soothing as much as possible, and you use your Yulon at the right times, then mana ceases to become an issue on this build at all. Like, if I really want to, I could heal a whole dungeon, even one like Ruby Life Pools, and probably never drop below 70% mana or something like that. And that is the nice part about this build as well, is it feels like my throughput is no longer a limiting factor at all. I went into another temple, had all of the trash on the way to the water boss, the first boss. For whatever reason, the tank thought it would be a good idea to pull that whole corridor together, and I was doing 100k HPS. Now, I spent my whole mana bar while I was doing that, but the benefit was that I had the ability to like really pump healing. Like, this is why I was saying before that I think Mistweaver, the casting Mistweaver, the right build, I guess, I think that is S tier throughput. I think it might even be higher than Druid. At the time I was 381 or 380 item level. Still trying to figure out a lot of the talent choices and stuff on the build, so it wasn't that optimized. My play wasn't great, and I could still do 100k HPS for quite a while on like an enormous trash pool. So throughput has stopped feeling like a limiting factor to my play on my Mistweaver entirely. Now it feels more like my good play is my efficiency, and knowing when I can get away with Soothing to save mana, and knowing when I need to press Enveloping, and knowing when I need to press Yulon. That effectively sums up what I've been doing this week. Once I found this build, I think the first dungeon I played with this build was that temple that I assumed was going really wrong with the tank pulling the whole corridor of trash, and I was doing ridiculous throughput, and I thought to myself, okay, this is now what I'm playing all week. So since then, this is the only healer I've been playing. Like I said, I think a little while ago, I think the initial kind of trap I fell into, or the mistake I made, was that I was trying to play around life cycles too much. That might change when I get 4-piece and after the Vivify buff next week. I might end up pressing it a little bit more than I do now, but for the most part, I lean heavily into Enveloping, and that is because it spreads my Renewing Mist. That's like, at the end of the day, that's really what it comes down to. Going into a bursty AoE mechanic and only having 2 Renewing Mists out means that Vivify oftentimes is not a good button to press. But if I lean into Enveloping Mists, then I can, especially with 96% haste at the moment, I can very quickly blanket the whole group with Renewing Mist and do a lot of healing through the Enveloping Mist cleave from Tear of Morning. One of the things I'm noticing with this caster, the Tear of Morning build, is that my Renewing Mist coverage is always maxed, like it's always on all 5 targets in the party when I need it to be. And that was one of the things I was noticing, or shortcomings I was noticing with Rising Mist, is that if I was running into a boss fight, and generally, like usually I would have 1 Renewing Mist charge or something, and there was already 1 Renewing Mist out on the party. So then, I would start the boss fight with 2 Revs. And until I had pressed RSK 3 or 4 or something times, my Rem coverage wasn't good. Same thing with even just normal trash packs. I could go into a trash pack and not have good Rem coverage, which meant that Vivify felt very weak or anemic in some situations as a Fistweaver, because my Rem coverage was conditional on a cooldown, and whenever I couldn't use the cooldown, being Rising Sun Kick, my Rem coverage basically dropped off a cliff. But with the Tear of Morning build, because there's no cooldown on Enveloping Mist and it works the same way with Rapid Diffusion, I can start a boss fight and just heal it normally, and before I know it, just with a few Enveloping Mists here and there, I always have full Rem coverage, because the enveloping that procs the rem has no cooldown like RSK does. As far as how the healer meta is shaping up, as of week 4, not that much has changed. Everyone still seems to be preferring Resto Druid and Preservation Evokers, no surprise there. Holy Pally is still slightly behind them in A tier, again, no real surprise there. What is a bit of a surprise is that Holy Priest and Resto Shaman have managed to hold on to B tier or be in B tier. I think Resto Shaman is here. I know it gets like a very, very bad rep on Reddit and the forums and stuff, but I don't think Resto Shaman is as bad as I guess a lot of people make it out to be. And I could just be not interpreting what people mean very well, because in my opinion, I don't think Resto Shaman is that bad per se. I don't think it's Shaman that's particularly bad. I think it's that Preservation Evoker is the same spec, but better. And by that, I mean Resto Shaman is like Evoker without the numbers. They both have kind of weak single target healing. They both have good stacked healing. They both bring Bloodlust. They both have strong or like very powerful healing cooldowns, like throughput cooldowns. The real clue is that both masteries are the same. It's just the Evoker one is significantly better than the Resto Shaman one, unfortunately. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that it doesn't surprise me too much that they're in B, because I think if you really want to play Resto Shaman, I don't think they take much to make work. But I also think if you're going to play a Resto Shaman, why not just play an Evoker? It's the same thing, except Evoker is numerically much stronger. There has to be something going on with Holy Priest that I'm not quite understanding. They must be much better than I kind of think they are, because I can understand that they might be in B because they have better throughput than Disc, definitely. Better throughput than Fistweaver, definitely. But from my play, this could be a similar situation to Mistweaver. Maybe I'm just playing it wrong. Maybe I'm playing the wrong build. But from my experience, Holy Priest is really just like you go into a dungeon, you spam flash heal, you spam heal 300 times each, and you press Prayer Mending on cooldown, and you apotheosis and rely on your holy words for your big kind of like cooldown healing. It could honestly just be here because it has the throughput. Disc at the moment doesn't. I don't think this is really a surprise to anyone. They have fallen, I believe, a tier from last week. That makes sense to me because trash packs, generally there are ways, especially in very good groups, to get by without really doing much healing. It's the boss fights that are really unavoidable damage on boss fights that is really punishing for Disc, and that's what this week is. Tyrannical keys are just not going to be good for Disc Priest because every dungeon has some boss that requires crazy throughput, whether it's Stone Step, or it's Meladrusa, or it's Herja, or it's Greywing in Azure Vaults. There's something in every dungeon that Disc is going to struggle with, just numerically speaking, just the ability to move health bars back up. I know Mistweaver is yet again the only healer, I think for 2 or 3 weeks in a row now, that's in F tier. I think Fistweaver is probably shouldn't be that much different than Disc. They both have some things they're quite good at. They both have some boss fights and situations they can, again, be quite good at, but some that they really suck at. And Fistweaver has, to me, the same kind of problem as Disc, in that they pay a very high premium for throughput, healing throughput, because they deal damage, at least as far as Blizzard is concerned. I don't particularly agree with it, especially when, like, Preservation, I think, does more damage than anybody else, and they don't really pay a premium for anything, but I can understand why Fistweaver specifically is in F tier. Now, I would go so far as to say that I can see Disc and Fistweaver here in the same kind of occupying the same space, but the casting Mistweaver build, I would definitely put it higher than these other two. I think it has significantly more throughput than Holy Priest or Resto Shaman, significantly more throughput than Holy Paladin. It also, Mistweaver has surprisingly good defensives. You can take Dampen, Diffuse, Fort Brew if you really want it. With the proc, when you take 20% of your health as a single hit, you get, I believe, a 20% damage reduction, along with the flat, I think it's 4% avoidance as well. So for those reasons alone, just because it's so defensively strong and I think the throughput is there, I would at least put it in A. Like I said before, I hesitate to put it in S because most people don't even like 2 specs being in S. They see S as being like the one healer that's significantly better than everything else. Whereas I see S as more of like all of these, let's say if I was going to put Mistweaver or casting Mistweaver in S tier, all of these 3 healers have more than enough throughput to heal all content at the moment. They all have good defensives. They all bring some form of utility. Yes, Lust and Bloodlust is way better than anything Mistweaver brings, I think, but healing at least is not an issue. I'm going to have, I think, more of an informed opinion on this after next week. I'm going to really try and push for like 400 item level or as close as I can get. I want to get gear on my Mistweaver. I really want to get into higher keys and see how it performs. I think the throughput is there, and that is probably the one thing that I think now is more important on all healers than ever before. So I'm very interested to see how that kind of plays out. The way I'm thinking about healers at the moment is quite, I guess, different to how Subcreation is ranking them. Subcreation is looking at the data from the WoW API based on 3,200 runs for this week, ranging in difficulty from 18s to 25s. So it's looking at the very like cream of the crop Mythic Plus players. The way I would summarize, or the way I think about them at the moment, all these healers, is that the S and A, the top tier healers, have the ability to carry groups, right? One DPS runs the whole dungeon without using a defensive, or they stand in a couple of things they shouldn't, and they don't bring health pots and whatever. Or the tank, someone like body pulls 2 packs together or something. These are the top tier healers, are the healers that have the throughput to carry those situations. And I think the other healers don't. The other healers, I think, spend most of their time in high keys just keeping themselves alive and doing a lot of triage healing. It is kind of wild how much my opinion on Mistweaver has changed this week. I remember reading the proposed January 10th hotfix changes, and I remember reading Mistweaver, 5% throughput buff, and I thought to myself, how the hell does the worst healer in the game right now get the same 5% throughput buff that the best healer in the game got like 2 weeks ago, right? This must be a joke. I've even written down in my notes from earlier in the week, I don't know what Blizzard are afraid of here. They seem so trigger happy with, 40% Vivify nerf, 40% Ancient Teachings nerf and things at the end of beta, and now they're so hesitantly buffing Mistweaver by like 5% here and 5% there. And at the time, like I said, I didn't know what Blizzard were afraid of. And now with the caster build, I think that might be what Blizzard have in mind when they're looking at this. They know that if they buff the kind of generic throughput on Mistweavers enough to make Fistweaving viable, then the casting build is going to get absolutely out of control. And the difference has been night and day. Looking back at my notes, I have things like from an earlier key in the week, I was obviously Fistweaving. And I remember I had a key where on Halls of Valor, second last boss, Scovold, after the Aegis shield drops, he charges someone with Fellblaze Rush. The whole group happened to stay stacked for that, and they all got the dot, and we wiped. And I remember how, I wrote out in chat to them, I'm sorry, while other healers may be able to heal through that kind of thing, I can't heal through 4 people getting the bleed or the debuff on them. Especially as a Fistweaver, I can only hit 1 target. I don't think I had Shiji up at the time or anything. And even if I did, I'm not sure if it really would have been possible. But now I think back to that situation and I think, I just would have pressed Yulon and like 1 enveloping mist and it probably would have been fine. I could heal through a lot of those kind of small one-off mistakes here and there, whereas they seemed like key bricking mistakes at the time. Even having Yulon up. Now, I know this is the same for Shiji, that you can have Shiji up for every Eye of the Storm on Hoja, every second Slicing Winds in Court of Stars, every Storm on Tempest, and so on. It's up very often, especially for their kind of big, unavoidable damage mechanics. But Yulon by default hitting 5 targets instead of just randomly 3 has felt really good, and it just does significantly more healing. I mean, that's pretty much the bottom line. And not having the Feline Stomp branch talented means that you can spend the talent points on making your cooldown, your Celestial, so much stronger. It's been a real game changer for me. As far as Resto Shaman goes, as far as the ease of dungeon tier list, it hasn't changed a great deal. The major thing is that Court of Stars is now just so unbelievably free, because it used to be the only thing that was difficult was healing Sometimes the second last boss, if it lasted too long, if you have one death there and the boss fight gets prolonged, it gets harder and harder to heal because it's a ramping damage mechanic. But for most groups, healing that second last boss wasn't a huge deal. It was healing the slicing winds on Melandris. Now that that's been nerfed, along with the lines on the ground being changed to purple, I think that's why Quarter Stars is now S. Shadowmoon Burial Grounds going from S to A seems like, especially at the highest level, this seems like it's almost entirely down to the last boss. The worm boss on Tyrannical is ridiculous. It's like 6 minutes or 5 minutes or something in high keys. That hasn't changed. What has changed is the last boss. The way high groups used to do it up until a couple of days ago was when the wall of ads comes out, that in everyone's normal pug keys, they just pick mark a skull on one of the ads. The group kills it and then they can run through that hole in the wall. On high keys, the way it's done is that the group just runs to the very end of the room where the wall is finishing and eats the wall damage. They don't kill the ad, they just run through the wall. And the reason why it's possible is because, as of a couple of days ago, the damage that the wall does to players stops when the wall despawns, when the wall goes away. So they would effectively all take the dot, and then that dot disappears as the wall disappears, which meant that they had more time to DPS the boss. They didn't have to kill the ad. But now that's been changed, so I think that is the sole reason why Shadowmoon Burial Grounds has gone from S to A. That last boss is now somewhat difficult as the ad needs to die. Not Good Offensively has stayed in B. This, surprisingly to me, Not Good Offensive seems like the balanced dungeon right now. It seems like the trash is somewhat difficult, or at least punishing on Fortified, and the bosses are as well on Tyrannical. But the change to increase the cast time on, I think it was Quickshot, or like increase the delay between Gale Arrow and Quickshot on the second last boss, has meant that Not Good really feels like a mechanics check. If you do everything cleanly, you shouldn't have any issues. There aren't really any like crazy one-shots. It's not free, it's not a walk in the park, but it's also not a complete fiesta. I think the 3 dungeons in C tier, Algathar, Temple of the Jade Serpent, and Ruby Life Pools, all feel like they could be B tier. They feel like the same kind of level as Not Good, except their timers are a little bit tight. Maybe next week on Fortified, all of those actually bump up to B, because they also have somewhat difficult boss fights. Croth gets harder in higher key levels because you can't get away with not activating wind. Veximus also becomes a bit of a healing check. I've noticed that even in like 15s and 16s Tyrannical. But apart from the timer, the rest of the dungeon seems not too bad. At least I don't think it warrants a C tier other than the timer. But this is purely conjecture for me. I haven't read too much about Algathar Academy in high keys, and obviously I'm not at that point yet where I'm doing high keys. I think Temple is a case, again, I think I said it last week, of bringing the right composition to make that dungeon much more forgiving. A second Dispel or Mass Dispel goes a long way. Same with a Curse Dispel to making that dungeon manageable. But after groups have really figured out Stone Step, and with the first boss still being free, it seems like the first half of the dungeon is effectively free, and it isn't until you get out to the Shah Courtyard that things get a little hairy. And I think that comes down to mostly the ability of the tank and the healer to coordinate defensives for the tank buster on the second last boss, and then the ability for groups to cleanly do the final boss. I'm surprised that Ruby Life Pools is still in C. I imagine that would go up to B with Not Good with the nerfs to Meladrusa, but it could be that the last boss is still a bit of a roadblock in high keys, especially Tyrannical, with just the Inferno doing so much damage. Halls of Valor being D isn't too much of a surprise to me either. It's a 5 boss dungeon on Tyrannical week, so that automatically probably puts it in D tier anyway. Its timer isn't particularly lenient still, and Fenrir and Herja are still big HPS checks. The last boss is also quite easy to mess up, just because the brands going out is so dangerous. The one issue Azure Vaults has had for the whole of the season so far is just that the timer is so incredibly tight. It also feels like people are still trying to figure out a good route for this. Because of the way the dungeon works with its levels and its like corridors, it seems like a lot of groups are really struggling to figure out efficient routes. It seems like there aren't that many choices. You have to play through certain rooms. And it seems like there isn't very many good opportunities to pull efficient trash and then skip the inefficient trash. It seems like everyone kind of has to do the same thing. So until something changes there, I imagine Azure Vaults just stays F pretty much forever. I have heard that the last boss gets easier with a certain strategy that allows the healer to kite the orbs, or like attract all the orbs to one spot. That effectively means that apparently the boss can be kept in one location with the whole group doing its normal thing, killing the crystals and killing the boss, and then the healer effectively manages the orbs. Now, I don't know how the orbs work exactly. Like I said, I've only kind of heard rumors about this strategy, because I know that the orbs do chase healers sometimes, but also not other times. So I'm not quite sure how that works. If it's a simple matter of like being near the orbs and healing teammates that gets aggro, so to speak, of the orbs, which means the orbs follow the healer and then you just move the orbs around away from the group. Unfortunately, if it is the case that that's how it works, that it seems like that's basically a druid only strategy, because they're the only healer that can completely negate the slow and stay moving at all times just by shifting forms. But that'll be it for this week. This has been a very long one, so if you've stuck with me, thank you. And algorithm stuff.